The alley reeked of rain-soaked concrete and something faintly metallic. It was the kind of night that pressed on your chest, heavy and suffocating, the kind of night where secrets hung in the air like ghosts. Mia's hand trembled as she held the letter, its edges soaked through and smudged. She could barely make out the words anymore, but it didn't matter. She knew them by heart. The single phrase at the bottom burned in her mind like a brand. Meet me where it all began. A shadow moved behind her, the faint scrape of a boot against the wet ground. She froze, her heart racing. It wasn't the first time she felt watched. For weeks she'd felt it, that prickling awareness, the unmistakable sensation of eyes tracing her every move. Slowly she turned her head, but the alley was empty. Just the flicker of a dying street lamp and the soft patter of rain against the dumpsters. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She fumbled it out with shaking hands. A text. No name, just a number she didn't recognize. "You're late. Don't make me come find you." Her breath hitched. She knew who it was. Knew it with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. 3 years had passed, but his words still carried that same quiet menace. The kind that wasn't loud or overtly violent, but insidious, creeping into your veins like poison. Theo. It had all started when Mia was 17, the summer she'd met Theo at a gas station on the edge of town. He'd leaned against his motorcycle, his leather jacket cracked and worn, a cigarette dangling from his lips. His eyes, piercing and calculating, had locked onto hers as if he could see right through her. She'd felt like prey, but it didn't stop her from walking closer. "Need a ride?" he'd asked, his voice low and smooth, like velvet soaked in danger. She should have said no. Every cell in her body had screamed at her to turn around, but instead, she'd nodded. That summer had been a whirlwind of stolen kisses, midnight drives, and promises whispered in the dark. Theo had a way of making the world disappear, of pulling her into his orbit so completely that she couldn't see anything else. But it wasn't long before she noticed the cracks, the way his temper flared without warning, the bruises on his knuckles he wouldn't explain, the lies that dripped from his tongue like honey. Mia had been too young to understand what love was, too naive to see that it wasn't supposed to feel like drowning. By the time she realized she needed to get out, it was too late. Theo had sunk his claws in deep, and leaving him had been the hardest thing she'd ever done. 3 years. That's how long it had taken for her to rebuild her life, to find a version of herself that didn't flinch at shadows or jump at every creak of the floorboards. And now, he was back. The meeting point was a derelict park on the outskirts of town, a place that had once been vibrant with laughter and the smell of freshly cut grass. Now it was nothing but rusted swings and overgrown weeds. This was where they'd first met, where she'd first fallen under his spell. She wasn't surprised he'd chosen it. Mia stepped off the sidewalk and into the park, her boots squelching in the mud. The letter was still clutched in her hand, its ink running in black streaks down the paper. Her eyes darted around the shadows, searching for him. And then she saw him, leaning against the frame of the swing set, his figure bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the street lamp. Theo hadn't changed. He was still tall, still broad-shouldered, still radiating that same intoxicating mix of charm and danger. But his eyes, there was something colder about them now, something that made her stomach twist. "You came," he said, his voice carrying easily over the distance between them. He stepped forward, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. "You didn't leave me much of a choice," Mia replied, forcing steel into her voice. She wouldn't let him see her fear. Theo smirked, tilting his head. "Still got that fire. I always liked that about you." "Why am I here, Theo?" she asked, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted," he said, his smirk fading into something darker. "You." The word hit her like a slap. She shook her head, taking a step back. "No, you don't get to do this. You don't get to just show up and act like what? Like I own you?" His voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried an edge that made her skin crawl. He took another step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Let's not pretend, Mia. You and I both know how this ends." "No," she said, her voice shaking. "You don't own me. Not anymore." Theo stopped, his expression hardening. For a moment the mask slipped, and she saw the rage simmering beneath the surface. But then he smiled again, slow and deliberate, like a wolf sizing up its prey. "Maybe not," he said. But we're not done, Mia, not by a long shot. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her arm, and she jerked away, her heart pounding. His smile widened, as if her fear was exactly what he wanted. You'll come around, he said, turning and walking away, his boots echoing against the empty playground. You always do. Mia stood there long after he was gone, the rain soaking through her clothes and chilling her to the bone. She knew he was right. That was the worst part. No matter how far she ran, no matter how much she changed, Theo would always be a part of her. He was in her blood, her bones, her very soul. But for the first time in years, she felt something stir inside her. Not fear, not despair, but something stronger. A spark of defiance. Maybe he was right that this wasn't over, but this time she wouldn't run. This time she would fight. For herself, for her freedom, for a chance to finally break free of the chains he'd wrapped around her heart. The rain fell harder, washing away the smudged ink on the letter, and as Mia turned and walked back into the night, she realized something. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.